intelligence is about speed and search, speed and accuracy of information search and processing, then is it also the same thing with rationality too? So all of decision making is about things that happen in the future. So like quite a lot of times I give this as an example to my students. So imagine if all of these labor have a CV with them and they are standing there, and then there's somebody who's coming in as a recruiter who's looking at the CV and then negotiating on the employment and then taking. Essentially, that's what is happening. But it's just that they don't have a CV. These guys don't have a brand name to attach for themselves. They don't have an employment contract.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Inductive Economy, the podcast where we delve into the intersection of technology, economics, policy, and progress. I'm your host Vignesh Swaminathan, and today I have the privilege of hosting a distinguished guest whose work delves into the intricacies of human behavior and economic structures. Joining me today is Dr. Venkat Ram Reddy, an esteemed researcher and scholar whose expertise spans the realms of behavior, rationality, and the intricate connections between motivation, cognition, and affect. Dr. Reddy's work, grounded in a deep understanding of the human psyche, sheds the light on a fascinating interplay between individual choices and the broader economic landscape. Our conversation with Dr. Reddy begins by unraveling the layers of human behavior. We explore the complexities of decision-making, the factors that influence our choices, and the subtle interplay between rationality and the myriad of emotions that guide our actions in the economic realm. Journey with us into the intersection of motivation, cognition, and affect. Dr. Reddy provides unique insights into how these fundamental aspects of human psychology intertwine, influencing not only our personal lives, but also shaping the dynamics of the markets and economies at scale and around us. The spotlight then turns to the structure and functioning of labor Addas, the proverbial marketplaces where daily wage laborers in India find work. Dr. Reddy takes us on a deep dive into the intricacies of these labor markets, unraveling the social and economic factors that govern the lives of those reliant on them. Get ready for a thought-provoking conversation that traverses the realms of psychology, economics, and societal structures. Dr. Venkat Ram Reddy brings a wealth of knowledge and a keen understanding of the human condition, offering a glimpse into the complexities that shape our economic interactions. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Venkat Ram Reddy.
Venkat, thank you so much for joining the Inductive Economy.
Thank you, Vignesh.
Great. So, Venkat, you're currently at IIT Jodhpur. Right?
Yes.
Before we dive into your work and your research and your unique experiences that have brought you here, IIT Jodhpur is one of the new IITs that has been built.
Yes.
So, can you talk to me a little bit about how, what's different about IIT Jodhpur? How's the environment been in terms of academics, research? How's your experience been?
Right. So the Indian Institute of Technology, Jodhpur, began its journey around 2008 as part of the second generation IITs. I had joined this institute in around 2020 after my brief stint at IIT Delhi as a faculty here at the School of Management and Entrepreneurship. Talking about the newer IITs in general, because these are spin-offs from the older IITs which date back to 50s and 60s. Largely, the newer IITs also sort of bringing the same kind of academic culture and research rigor that is sort of well known with the older IIT setup. And that's the case with IIT Jodhpur too. And over the past few years, particularly with respect to the institution here and the kind of academic programs that we've been able to envision with the leadership within the institute, we have been more or less cutting edge in all of the domains across the board, whether it is sciences, technology, or even management education, particularly with respect to the programs that we run here at the School of Management and Entrepreneurship. Our flagship program is MBA Technology, which is kind of first of its kind, perhaps in the country when we started off, where the idea has been to sort of bring in the elements of technology into management education and sort of relook how organizations, which we have been seeing over the past few years, how businesses have been sort of building themselves up using technology. So that's the kind of input that we bring to the classroom as well. And beyond MBA Tech, we also in the recent times launched a new program, which is MBA in FinTech, which is again an upcoming area. And that's where again the school has shown leadership to sort of bring in a management program within the domain of FinTech and look at how technology and finance are coming together to sort of reshape the finance industry that we traditionally know of. So across the board, one key observation is that a lot of our programs have a technology blend, and particularly the emerging technologies, whether it is of AI, ML, or if you talk about energy sector, we are talking about green tech and green energy. So across the board, this is the kind of, so to speak, a USP that IIT Jodhpur has, and that has been a conscious choice from the academic leadership within the institute.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting because my follow up to that is, uh, you know, uh, MBA is not what an MBA was 20 years ago.
Right.
And there has been significant progress in terms of requirements, technologies, etc. And how did the leadership team and you and all the faculty members come together in accepting that A, it's not enough to just produce people who are MBAs.
Right.
B, there is a technical aspect of managing a business.
Right.
That simply isn't about putting an entry in an Excel file or passing along a presentation. And
Right.
C, uh, how is it also tied to outcomes where young people in India today are also looking to entrepreneurship as a way forward instead of relying on the name brand companies for placements.
Right. So if you look at historically, you look at the history of management education, not just in India, across the globe, it goes back to early 1900s when Henry Fords of the world tried to sort of building a certain set of skill set within the organization who would go about managing people on the shop floor. That is perhaps the origins of management education as we know it, because as an entrepreneur, which Henry Ford was, it is always difficult to manage the entire organization, particularly when you're scaling up in terms of production processes and so on and so forth. So a lot of early American industrialists sort of built in this management as a domain, and the kind of skill sets that they were looking at were essentially to do with managing people on the shop floor and reporting back to the entrepreneurs. And that's where the management education started off and eventually brought to India. And now we have a full-fledged set of business schools, management education across the board, supported by government of India as well as a whole lot of private institutions that are doing this. But if you see the skill sets that are required back in the day when Henry Ford began trying to visualize a stream of skill set within the organization to what organizations require today. Largely, that need of having a manager to manage people perhaps is not the only role that managers are to play today. So, a lot of emerging roles are about not just managing people within the organizations, it's about managing customers that the organization tries to attract. It's also about managing the investors who are who sort of bringing the capital for the firm in the first place, managing a whole lot of other stakeholders beyond employees. Right? And one of the recent additions to this is also managing the technology itself, because technology has been a key ingredient in the recent past in terms of how do you scale up the kind of offerings that you have as a firm to the customers that you're looking at. And technology has been playing a key role, and particularly with the emerging landscape on digital technology, this is something that we have not been able to sort of picturize, let's say, 2 decades ago as to how would firms use digital technology. But today we can see the kind of scale, exponential growth that digital technology is offering. So that has been the source of reasoning for us to see when we were conceptualizing a management program with IIT Jodhpur. The leadership, particularly the leadership within the institute, thought about how do we bring in this technology aspect? Because the world over, if you see how firms are using technology, is that something that manager should also be aware of. Right? It's not so much about development of these tools. That is, of course, the core competence of the engineering disciplines, which is what IITs are always known for. But what is a management school within an IIT role should be, and how should it look like? And that's where this entire blending of technology into the management curriculum came in with our school, and we have been first of its kind amongst the IITs as well as amongst the IIMs and IITs as an ecosystem, to be able to visualize the role of technology within the organizations and then weave a program around it, so that managers who go into these organizations need not only be looking at managing people or managing finances. Today, they also have to manage technology. And that's been the core thesis of the school and the programs that we have been developing over the past few years.
Amazing, amazing. So, before we came into this recording session, you and I had a chance to chat.
Right.
And, one very interesting thing that, you had told me was that, hey, yaar, I am a self-taught economist and I'm a self-taught psychologist. At least I'm
Right.
starting there, at least right now. So, can you talk a little about, your journey as a self-taught economist and self-taught psychologist?
Right. So my academic journey sort of began when I started off with my master's when I back in 2012 when I was at IIT Madras. I was doing my MSc there in the domain of management, and the program sort of required us to do a thesis at the end of our program and to be able to graduate from the program. And this is where my first introduction to research and academic research in a formal setting sort of happened. And as a youngster in early 20s, first of all, it was kind of difficult to sort of make a head around as to what academic research is and formal research is all about. So it took some bit of time to try and understand what exactly are we to do in formal research. Then came the question of, what is that I would be interested in, right? And that's where, thanks to the institution where I was studying, and that sort of is common to all the IITs, is we have a lot of independence, especially when it comes to our academic journeys, to see what are the problems that we want to pick up, how do we want to go about solving them, and so on and so forth. And that was the kind of independence that was given even to our master's students way back in 2012. And one of the professors there sort of said that, look, it's up to you to figure out what is that you would want to solve. Then came, upon some reflection that, look, what is that I had struggled with henceforth, so far, right? And one of the things that I struggled with in my own life was making decisions. And so quite often, something that we often look at is at every step of the way, whether it is careers or whether it is personal life or whether it is day-to-day mundane aspects too, we always struggle with one such aspect, which is making decisions, sieving through sort of, or sifting through choices and picking up options. So something that occurred to me, because I struggled quite a bit when I was trying to look at what kind of study should I pick up when typically after school. Should I get into maths? Should I get into engineering? Should I get into something else? So that was a choice set that I struggled with. Then after I entered my undergraduate degree, then again I just sort of struggled with, is this something that I would want to continue with for the next set of few years or entire life, or is it something that I don't like and should I move to something else? So at every step of the way, I had this struggle in terms of making choices. And that sort of hit me when my faculty said that, look, you can pick up a problem statement and study it. Then I said, okay, one problem that I have been facing so far was about making decisions. And then I said, why not pick up this particular context and see what exactly is the research saying on decision making? And that's when I started my journey. And then try to look at what are the formal research that exists in this space. And then I realized that, look, it's not just a question of an individual making a decision, which is largely what psychologists often talk about. But this is also formally studied by economists. In fact, some of the major understanding that we have, major set of ideas that we have on decision making stem from economics. So that itself was a revelation for me back in the day. So then I started looking at both how psychologists sort of approach this particular context as well as how economists look. So that's where I eventually become a self-taught economist, self-taught psychologist, primarily because I was interested in understanding my own decision making and where was I getting it right, where was I getting it wrong, what could I do to sort of improve. And yeah, that's the origins of that particular statement that I made last time.
So one comment, one question. I hope they're fine. First is, it almost sounds like this is one of those very interesting cases of research is me search. That's what they say, right? That you want to understand yourself better. You want to understand what's happening. So you decide to take one aspect of how you operate as an individual human being and decide to understand what are the broader principles that emerge from the successes or failure of whatever you are trying to analyze.
Right.
And I think that is an incredibly powerful motivator to really make progress and really grow science. And number two is you spoke about those initial papers and books.
Right.
So can you talk about a couple of them that really influenced the way you think and look at the world, both
Right.
economics and psychology?
Right. Thanks for the comment. And I do, if I just have to add to that comment on research being research, see, essentially science has this one of the understandings that we have as, let's say, as a scientist is that you should always be independent of the object of study. So there is always this thing of being away from the object and not being involved with the object of study. But what I've seen over the past few years, at least my own understanding of science is and the way it's done is actually the other way around, where most of the understanding that we have come across and most of the great research that happens, great insights that we get, are actually from those people who are far more involved with the object of the study than anything else. So whether it is Darwin talking about evolution or whether it is about any other, let's say, major research understanding that we have got so far, my understanding is that it is always research that eventually ends up in bringing up an insight that the world also sort of gains from. And that's been perhaps my take, and that's how I look at research to the deep. And then, yeah, and that's on the comment on research being research. The second bit, yes. So when I started formally looking at what is that people have understood so far, particularly the two ideas that have shaped our understanding over the recent past on decision making, predominantly stem from two to three individuals, starting from Herbert Simon back in the 50s, where he came up with this idea of individuals and organizations becoming boundary rational. So the core idea was decisions are about the future. Options that we often pick up only realize in the future, right? So even let's say trying to consume something for the dinner and looking at all the choices, you know that the consumption will happen at some point in time in the future, and you are trying to sort of predict how would you feel like or how would you be like as an individual once you make that choice. So all of decision making is about things that happen in the future. Now the problem with anything happening in the future is there's a lot of uncertainty. Inherently, there is uncertainty about whether it would happen the way you thought it could. So two things that are sort of kind of given for any decision making is one, options play out in the future and they are realized in the future. Because they play out in the future, there's uncertainty associated with any kind of choice making or decision making that you engage in. And a lot of the times, what we do as human beings is to try and bridge that gap. So we want to see how do we ensure that the decisions that we make today and the outcomes that we would realize henceforth, that there is no gap in the way we visualize these decisions and the outcomes. And one of the things that we do as human beings is that we sort of bridge that uncertainty using information. So we seek in a lot of information which we believe could help us visualize how would things turn out, let's say 1 day ahead, or let's say 1 day or 1 year ahead, and so on and so forth. Right? So for a student who is trying to pick up a career choice, right, they will want to look at an undergraduate program that could lead to a career. Now that they're doing, the decision is happening around 4 years henceforth. Right? So at the time of you picking up a degree and studying it versus realizing a career outcome, there is a gap of at least 4 to 5 years. but you have to make this decision 4 years before the actual outcome comes in. So what does a student do? They go out and seek information, they go out to websites, they talk to people who have studied. So we do a whole lot of things to get to that piece of information which we think would help. And this is where Herbert Simon had this insight that look, how much information is enough for somebody to make a decision? And how much information is enough for somebody to cover that uncertainty that exists in a decision making part? And that's where his insight was that look, while you could go out and look out for every possible information that you could pick up, as human beings and as organizations, we don't have that kind of resources and wherewithal with us to pick up complete information to make a decision. So then the insight is that does that stop people from making decisions? Does it stop people, organization from making decisions? No. Right? So which means we are bounded. So that is the insight that Herbert Simon had, that in the ideal world, people would want complete information to make decisions, but in the real world, they don't get that complete information, which means they still have to bear with certain kind of uncertainty when they make decisions, which means largely we can only be boundedly rational. And our cognitive capacities are also boundedly rational, bounded in that sense, because you can only pick so much information at any point. So this was the first key insight that, from a formal understanding of decision making that sort of caught my interest. That people are boundedly rational, and a lot of our cognitive capacities were also limited to that extent. Then came the second wave, which was built on this idea of bounded rationality, which the duo, which is Kahneman and Tversky, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, were famous in terms of picking up this idea of bounded rationality. And they went further and tried to look at, okay, while we are boundedly rational, it also appears that the way we search and process information, there seems to be something interesting about it. Right? So while there is limitation at the cognitive level in terms of the extent of information that we could pick up, but how do you do it? Is where Kahneman and Tversky found that people often use, according to the term that formally is talked about, as heuristics. And so, which means even when I have limited information, I still use certain kinds of shortcuts to get to that limited information. Right? In certain contexts, I might not want to spend a whole lot of time processing the entire information, however limited it is. I might still want to look at certain shortcuts to get to that decision. And that is largely what the insight that Kahneman and Tversky brought to the table, which is of use of heuristics in searching and processing information when making choices. And the field sort of took off from that particular insight, and now we have a separate branch in some sense as a formal science called behavioral economics. The roots lie in Kahneman and Tversky's understanding that heuristics is what people use. And of course, there are multiple schools of thought. There is something called ecological rationality, which has come in post Kahneman and Tversky, where the researchers sort of argue that look, even when we use these shortcuts, it doesn't mean that we are always going to get those decisions wrong. So the heuristics are good. And so the field is kind of now divided. On the one hand, you have people who argue that heuristics are kind of bad and they will end up making people more biased. And the word bias kicks in, which is again controversial. But we do sort of sustain that argument that heuristics lead to biased decision making. And then there is a separate, the counter argument to that is no, heuristics are good for people and they sort of save time and energy for people to search for information and process it, because not always are we equipped to search and process information. So we do use heuristics in our day-to-day life to make decisions, and perhaps that helps. And that is largely the insights that I was able to sort of pick up as a key threads, starting from bounded rationality to heuristics in decision making to the idea of ecological rationality. We talked about heuristics as good for human beings, right? And that field is it's still a battle on both the sides, and every day we come up with some bit of research which will argue for this way and that way, and people are able to churn out evidence against. So the judgment is not yet out as to what is good for people and what is perhaps bad for people as when it comes to decision.
It's I'm just smiling because the last sentence you used to was judgment and uncertainty, right? There's
Right.
a famous Kahneman Tversky paper that they had written called Judgment Under Uncertainty or
Right.
something like that,
Right.
if I'm not mistaken. So I was just remembering that and I was just having a smile.
Right.
Uh, there is a very interesting history where there is almost a pre psychology influence to economics and a post psychology influence to economics.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about how economics changed forever
Right.
once psychology was brought into play?
Right. And I think the origins of how psychology has come into economics, and particularly the emergence of field of behavioral economics now, is again going back to these fundamental ideas that both Herbert Simon and Amos, Tversky and Kahneman, both of these luminaries in some sense have brought to the table. Because fundamentally what they said is that, look, when decision making happens, what is at play? According to both of them, it is the cognition that is at play. And cognition, until that point in time, was bread and butter of psychologists. These were the people who were trying to talk about how human beings think, reason, and so on and so forth. But here was a piece of evidence which was brought into formal economics and said that, look, we need to also look at how people think and reason to be able to understand the kind of decisions that we make. So the bridge happened with the work of Robert Simon and then Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, where the idea of cognition and the importance that you have to give to people's cognitive capabilities in the context of economics happened. Then a whole lot of other things sort of played out, right? So because cognition alone is not what human beings are out of, right? So if you think of our own selves and see, it's not just about reasoning is what we are meant for. So we also emote. A lot of us go through day in and day out a whole lot of emotions. A lot of us also tend to have a set of motives, wants, desires, and so on and so forth. Right. So then, the researchers sort of took off and said, okay, it's not just about how reasoning sort of impacts somebody's decision. It could also be about how emotions make sort of influence individual decision making. It could also be about how wants or desires people have influence decision making. So that sort of brought in the entire understanding that, look, when we have to study decision making, which was until Herbert Simon came in, was a formally only the domain of economists, and they made certain assumptions about how humans behave. Daniel, Robert Simon, and then Amos Tversky, Daniel Kahneman, and the rest of the researchers started questioning those foundational assumptions of how economists looked at human beings. And first segue happened with cognition, and the second set followed suit. And now we have a whole lot of concepts that were otherwise only studied by psychologists that we use now in the study of formal study of decision making, which is what the field of behavioral economics is all.
I'm actually really interested in your explanation to this question. That we spoke about psychology and economics. We spoke about rationality and economics.
Right.
We spoke about rationality and psychology. But I don't think we spoke about rationality and intelligence.
Right.
So, what is the relationship between rationality and intelligence? Because to use one of Kahneman's own, one of the terms popularized by Kahneman and Tversky, we have a hindsight bias that rationality is always the most superior form of intelligence. That it's a shortcut, that whenever there is a problem, the more rational you are, the more accurate your problem solving method will be. Almost to a certain extent. I know I am probably getting the details around it incorrectly, but what is this relationship between intelligence and rationality? That's question one.
Right.
And question two is, I think as a society, have we over relied on marking rationality as the high order bit for intelligence?
Right. So the relationship between again intelligence is again something that was perhaps bread and butter of psychologists back in the day. But the segue sort of as to what is this relationship between rationality and intelligence, and are they two different things or are they one and the same? Again, goes back to that idea that decision making is all about cognition. right? So if you think of how economists looked at it, if you think of how Herbert Simon looked at it, if you think of how Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman looked at it, all of them sort of emphasized this role of information search and processing as the way to make decisions, right? And the idea of intelligence is nothing but, in very simple terms, what formal intelligence studies sort of talked about, is that it is about search and processing of information, but on two different counts, on two related counts. One is the speed of search and processing, and the other is accuracy. Right? So a whole lot of intelligence tests, as we know of, and a whole lot of spin-offs of these IQ tests that we sort of now, in some sense, sort of acclimatize with as students in any formal education across the world, is largely we are put through a lot of these intelligence tests or spin-offs of these intelligence tests. If you see what happens in those tests is nothing but you are given a piece of information, you're told that there's a missing piece of information, and now it's your job to go and figure out what is that missing piece of information, and I'll rank people basis the speed and accuracy with which they do this. Right? It's literally that. Right? Any kind of standardized testing that you take, this is what is going on. It's just that in some standardized testing, the nature of information differs from each other. Right? For example, if you take a joint entrance examination to get into an IIT, the nature of information is about formal disciplines of physics, chemistry, math, and so on and so forth. But if you take a common admission test to get into an MBA program, it's no longer about physics, math, perhaps math, yes, but physics and chemistry, right? So there are other domains like verbal comprehension and so on. So if you look at it, largely what we understood and what we still understand and practice about intelligence is the speed and accuracy of information search and processing. Then the question came in that, look, if intelligence is about speed and search, speed and accuracy of information search and processing, then is it also the same thing with rationality too? Because Herbert Simon was talking about how human beings are sort of bounded in terms of information search and processing capabilities, inherently saying that human beings are bounded intelligence. And while he said human beings are bounded irrationally, now if you see how formal intelligence is sort of defined, it also means human beings are found boundedly intelligent. Right? If you think of how Kahneman and Tversky talked about heuristics. Heuristics are again nothing but shortcuts in terms of information search and processing, which means human beings, when I say they are heuristic, or they use heuristics, I'm also saying that maybe they are less of intelligent. So, because we have equated rationality and decision making to somebody's information search and processing capabilities, inherently we have made this assumption that intelligence and rationality are one and the same thing. But the interesting fact is that if you look at the world outside and see the kind of decisions that people make and the kind of outcomes that they end up with, somewhere you can see that there is always a kind of a disjunction, right? Or a dichotomy, so to speak, in most cases, if not all cases, right? So even if you have the smartest kid in the lot who is scored perhaps, let's say, the in terms of upwards of 90 percentiles in a standardized test. Now, what is the guarantee that that individual would actually make decisions that would go right? Right. So quite often what we see is in the real world, intelligence or rationality, as we understand from a formal setup, does not really play out the same way. So quite a lot of the times we might do well on standardized testing, but we might not really get a whole lot of decisions right. And this was exactly the problem statement that I picked up when it occurred to me that when I was trying to reflect on the science of decision making and trying to read up on this. And this is where I sort of picked up this idea that intelligence and decision rationality are two different aspects. And that's the beginning of my journey in terms of formal research. As to what I was interested in was this sort of dichotomy. What does it tell us, and where would it lead us? And that's been something that I've been sort of reflecting on, talking about, studying on for about a decade.
In fact, it's really interesting you brought up the case of IQ tests because I think in somewhere around 2019 you had published a paper called the Looking Glass or Intelligence Quotient Tests, the interplay of motivation, cognitive functioning, and affect, where you said that the understanding of purely, just cognitive function is not enough. You have to be able to you have to account for motivation and affect as well. Now, affect is, so there are two parts to this question. One is, people have heard of the word effect, but they have not heard of the word affect. And even when you say affect, they think of affect, which is, I might have affected somebody with something or something like that. So my first question is, just for the clarity of our listeners, can you please explain what affect is? That's number one. And number two is, what does this expansion of the question is, once you add motivation and affect to cognitive functioning, I think it stops being IQ in general.
Right.
Because IQ as a fundamental concept is very, very funneled. It's very, very narrow. It's very, very myopic. You broaden the horizon, right? By recommending the addition of affect and motivation.
Right.
Now, when you add those into the mix, what does it become in your opinion? So these are my two questions.
Sure. So formally, affect, AFFECT, is essentially a word that sort of comprises of all the kind of emotion states that human beings go through, right? So, because in formal sciences and our understanding of emotions, we have two categories of emotional states. One is emotions and the other is mood. And the idea is very simple, that in this, when you're experiencing an emotion, it is always about something, right? So, for example, if you have done well in an exam and you're happy, now happiness is about you being the topper in that exam, right? So emotions always tend to have an object inherently in there, right? It is always about something. There is something called intentionality. It's intended state. Whereas a mood, like for example, I'm sad, but I'm sad for no particular reason, and that mood state sort of lingers with you for longer durations than emotions. So broadly, affect is sort of comprising of both of these states, right? So both emotions and moods. When you talk about emotion, then we are not talking about moods, and when you're talking about moods, you're not talking about emotions. Of course, colloquially in our everyday usage, we all treat these as one and the same. But from a formal science, there is a distinction that emotions are about something, which means there is an inherent intentionality in there, whereas moods are not about something. You can't trace back to the origins of why are you feeling the way you are doing, right? So that's largely the understanding as to why we are using the word affect there and not, let's say, emotions and moods, because at the end of the day, both have certain kind of valence, both have certain kind of arousal, which is again two-dimensional characterization of an affect state. But it's just that it is much more broader in that even if you're not intentional, you still have certain kind of arousal and balance with you in the way you're experiencing things. Then you're still going to affect. So that's the first part. I hope that sort of clarifies as to why we're using the term affect and what does it mean. It sort of is comprising of emotions and moods. The second part and the core thesis of that paper is largely this, stemming from this entire reasoning, that usually when we talk about intelligence, we seem to be talking about information search and processing and speed and accuracy of it. Any score that you get on any standardized testing essentially is a reflection of that. Right? It is about how quickly and how accurately have you searched and processed information in a given context, and you're being ranked compared to others. Now, if that is the case, then how do we use these tests and how do we use those scores to make a whole lot of other kinds of decisions? So, for example, if I give out this test to an undergraduate student and then say that, look, given this ranking of your speed and accuracy of information search and processing, I'm going to get you to computer science engineering, or I'm going to put you in, let's say, biosciences, or I'm going to put you in medicine, or I'm going to put you in, let's say, management, which is what we do with the CAT exam. Now, how does it? That's where the sort of a dichotomy came to us when we were reflecting on it, because what you do as a computer science engineer and what you do as a management professional and what you do as a musician, what you do as anything, so to speak, is perhaps not only a function of the quickness with which you search and process information and the accuracy with which you do it. Of course, it's part of it, but it's not the entirety of it, right? So that's the dichotomy, which was the sort of the source of that reasoning that we presented in the paper. And the simple conclusion that we are making there in sort of became kind of famous because we were talking about revisioning the IQ as a domain, as a construct, is essentially this, that fine, you go ahead and use these IQ tests, you go ahead and build those scores, but when you interpret them, you should be only able to interpret them on the count of somebody's information search and processing and nothing beyond that. So, for example, again, something of my personal experience is as a kid growing up in India, and when we have these in the schools, you have these annual parent-teacher meetings, or let's say, report cards are given out to the parents about the kids' performance. I always used to observe this, that look, if the moment I score, let's say 90 out of 100 versus 100 out of 100 on the subject, the teacher would sort of inherently make this inference that I like those subjects.
Yeah.
Now, quite often that was not the case with me. Right? So I used to score a whole lot of marks in the top quartile, let's say, in all of these subjects. But if you were to really ask me what is that you like, maybe I would have quoted history, right, and not really math and science. But I was scoring those numbers. So then I used to wonder, actually, what does this even mean? Though I don't like, I got those numbers, which are perhaps an index of only my capabilities on information search and processing, nothing to do with my liking, right? But the point is that the teachers tend to infer that score as everything of that individual. So what we are trying to say in this paper is very simply that you continue with these assessments, you get those scores, you rank people, but at the end of the day, when you make a judgment basis those scores, you should be mindful of what those scores actually are about. Right? Those scores are actually about somebody's information search and processing and nothing more. You can't say somebody likes something just because they have scored something, right? So that is the inference that we have, and that sort of is even today when I reflect and I bring these discussions to the class, quite often the students also find that interesting, not just interesting but also disturbing to a great extent because they
or I'm sorry for interrupting, but or also even resonance.
Yeah.
Because it'll resonate with them that yeah, my teacher never saw my math performance or my physics performance as pure information retrieval and speed of output.
Right.
They assumed information retrieval and speed of output and misjudged it as interest. Yeah, as interest or a natural precocity for that subject.
Right. So the flip side of it, which is also something that we talked about in the paper, is the flip side of it is that this judgment that look, if you have done something well, it is because you're intelligent, and if you have not done something well, it is because because of which I would conclude that you're not intelligent, does not also hold good. Right?
Correct.
Because very simply, it could be a function of somebody's liking. Right?
Yeah.
And we are
or the performance of the teacher. It can be so many other
Right.
external variants because you don't control that.
Right.
Yeah.
So very simply, the teacher never tells my parents that your kid did not do well in this case because he or she did not like this. Right? It's a very simple statement to make, but it's a very profound one. If the teachers start making that statement with their parents, then it says that look, it has nothing to do with somebody's cognitive capability. Because what today teachers do, or at least in my time, what I have gone through, largely they would end up saying that look, your kid is not smart enough, right? Or your kid does not have the capability to do this. Now, instead of saying that, if you just say your kid does not like this, which is also true, and that's why those scores reflect those numbers reflect that as well, even from a formal science standpoint. And that's largely what we are trying to get. The moment we are able to sort of size these numbers around and sort of come up with more informed inferences about what these numbers are actually about, then you are good to go. Right? It's not that you don't have to throw out those numbers completely, because they still index some aspect of human behavior which is to do with cognition, but they don't index perhaps the liking that you would have to that particular context, or let's say the motivation that you would have to that context. So it takes away two other aspects of human behavior. One is emotions and motivations. And that's what we are trying to sort of argue in that way.
I'm just having another smile on my face because you spoke about these parent-teacher meetings,
Right.
and how often feedback in those parent-teacher meetings are either it's almost like a bell curve, right? They're all like, okay, he's a good kid, but he lacks focus, he lacks discipline. It's not very substantive. Like one of the things I have accepted as an adult is that when older people give you these words like be disciplined or be focused, I I automatically make a note mentally that these are suitcase words.
Mm.
You have to open the suitcase and unpack what it means, because that's a heuristic that they use because they're unable to define what that term actually means in a very precise and a logical manner.
Right.
So you get a lot of suitcase words thrown at you in these parent-teacher meetings, and when they come back and tell you, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, Vignesh is indisciplined. Vignesh is smart, but he doesn't apply himself. Okay. Great, very insightful quotes, but practically they are useless. I can't. It's information I can't do anything with because the input is not surgically precise. That is expected from somebody with experience. So that's my thing. That's number one. Number two is, I was just thinking while you were talking about this that, what if we actually, for example, just for, experiment sake, ran a reverse PTA? Call it a parent-student association. Okay. Where you take an average of your, I again, Todd Rose has done some great work on why average is not a very good statistical measurement of anything. But for simplicity's sake, let's take you take at the average of some set of students in a classroom, and you bring the teachers for a review, and the students actually review those teachers. The same way it happens in a parent-teacher conference. And if your teachers are old enough and they have lost their parents, for example, they bring their kids, and the kids have to take the report card of the teacher from those kids and take the same feedback. Do you think that will A, improve teacher outcomes, and B, do you think it will improve student outcomes because they now believe that they have the same responsibility? I know that this can go into a very Stanford prison. Obviously, there are problems in that also, but almost like a cyclical sort of a system where, because the teacher has been vindictive to a certain set of students, they'll come back with vindictive feedback about the teacher. And, I'm just very interested if that is a mechanism for feedback. Because if I give you feedback on a Google form, it doesn't mean anything. It will tell me a statistical mechanism for how I perform, but it doesn't tell you about how I feel. It's like music, right? I can look at sheet music and imagine what the sound is.
Right.
But when the music is played to me, it moves me, right? Do you think that dichotomy exists, and what do you think will happen if we ran something like this?
Right. So see, fundamentally, if you look at what happens in school education, and not just in school education, maybe within higher education, not just in India, across the globe, is largely we tend to given certain kind of input to the student, and then we have a performance metric through which we sort of evaluate as to how much the kid has picked up from that know-how that we have sort of imparted to the student. And that's where the exams come in, and that's where the scoring comes in, that's where the ranking of the students comes in, and that's where the feedback is given to the student. Right? So it's essentially performance feedback of the kid that you are sort of portraying it to the parents or to the kids themselves. Now, what we have, at least in higher education, and particularly I can talk about IITs as institutes of higher education, we do have, and this is an accepted practice across the globe as well in higher education, we do also have feedback mechanisms for the students to put across to the faculty. In fact, we have, during a semester term, we do it at least twice in writing and once in person. So for most of you or some of you do not know how the ecosystem functions, particularly in IITs, we have something called a class committee meeting. The idea of a class committee meeting is halfway through the semester, the students will come and the faculty will be sitting in a room, and the students will come and give you feedback course by course in a public meeting, right? Where the students would tell what is good or bad about the course and what could perhaps change in the next remaining part of the semester. So that's the verbal feedback. So that's like the equation. So the parents are not
But
there,
Venkat,
but the students are there.
I agree. But Venkat, I'll just interrupt you here for 1 second. When you are 18 and 19 doing that, it's very different from doing it when you're, 13 or 14.
Right, right.
So when you're 18 or 19, you have some level of, some dimension of responsibility and conscientiousness.
Right.
Okay. I agree, conscientiousness is not equally distributed. Okay. But there is some level of rational behavior you can expect from a 18 or a 19-year-old. Okay. But not from a 13, 14, 15-year-old.
Right.
Right. And the purpose of giving that example was not for college education, because college education knows that school education is screwed up. Okay. So they put these mechanisms as checks and balances in place to actually resolve the problems which are not addressed accurately in school. Right. You had no formal openings to actually have conversations with teachers. Teachers were actually seen more as authority figures rather than people who were with you on a co-learning journey. Many professors even behave that they are the authority figure, and to a certain extent, yes, they are. But they are enabling you on an ability to learn for the rest of your life. That is the true role, right? My only curiosity was, if I was 15.
Yeah.
And I was in that meeting, and some teacher comes and asks, how did I perform this term? I would have been brutal. I would have said that, what, I actually like music. Okay. In intelligence, there is this term called G, right? And the general idea, the holy grail of any research is, do you have translatability for G? Right? Can you transfer intelligence from one domain to the next? Okay. There has always been this myth. Maybe it works for some people, but the myth has generally been that if you are a good chess player, you will be a good computer programmer. Or if you are a good musician, you can be a good physicist or a good scientist. Okay. Having had some training in music, I like patterns. I like symmetry. Okay. But I stunk at geometry. It's simply not possible, because when I listen to music, I see shapes, I see patterns. Okay. And that's how I understand. There are many people who learn music through the calculations of counts and beats and all of that. And then there are people like me who are like, this is too complicated. I'm able to see the sound. Why do I need to care about, why do I need to care about what the math is? It'll sit. That is how, some people think. So in that context, when I'm 14, when a learner is 14 or 15, to have that level of unfiltered feedback, I think it will reflect on the teacher on how they make their students feel. Because when you start treating it as a 9 to 5, and the student has an aptitude for it, but you don't know how to channel it, probably this is a problem of the ratio. It's a 1 to 40 ratio, 1 to 30 ratio, or whatever. But I think that is where the problem is, no?
Right. So see, fundamentally, if you look at the function of feedback, is that you improve basis the feedback that is given to you. It's common in organizations. It's common in, let's say, school education, higher education, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things, in fact, there is one working paper that we are looking at. Incidentally, talks about while you can give the feedback the other way around, to parents and to students can come in and give the teacher the feedback. The question is that accounted for in the performance, right? So while the numbers that you get at the end of a semester are largely about student performance in the class, now nowhere is the grade
faculty performance is considered.
Let's say the feedback of the teacher, right?
Yeah.
So this is something that we were looking at as a construct as to if we were to account for that feedback in the student score. It is accounted for in the performance evaluation of the teacher.
Correct.
Right? When the teacher has to be promoted or when the teacher has to be incentivized, the student's feedback is often taken into consideration, or the parent-student feedback is taken into consideration for the teacher's career progression. But the idea is that, look, how does it also, because it matters more fundamentally for the student's grades. Now, can you also look at, is there a way to sort of offset somebody's feedback that they receive for teaching in the student grade itself? Because then you are making a more humane assessment of the student's learning. Because what if I have been taught by a teacher who for whatever reasons, I'm not able to process the information or process the know-how. Now, but the same student is able to do it with a different subject and with a different teacher. So which means perhaps the blame is not entirely on the student. And today, the numbers, the way we sort of generate those numbers, are essentially putting the onus on the student itself.
Correct.
But is there a way to sort of account for it? So my take on that would be fine. We can do the two-way feedback part in this case, where the teacher gives the feedback to the student and the student and the parent gives the feedback to the teacher. But the point is, even more fundamentally, can you account for it in the way the grading is done? Now, that's a more harder question to look at, but perhaps a more fruitful one, because then you are sort of that numbers that you're generating at the end of the semester are more reflective of what actually is happening in terms of a dialectic between the teacher and the student, and not just the onus is pushed onto the student.
As you do, this kind of work, and you're able to see multiple dimensions to a single argument that has historically existed in our society, including and especially. What do you make of the new education policy that has come out?
Right. In fact, I think that document that we've been able to get across in the past few years has sort of brought in some of this cutting-edge research. Some of the policy formulations that the new education policy has, in fact, has accounted for some such research that I'm talking. Right. So, for example, if I may allow a student to take a standardized test 3 times a year instead of once a year, which was the practice earlier. Now that inherently takes in the account. Of course, perhaps it's not the most optimum, but maybe you could have it every day and people can come in and walk in and do the tests every day if they want to. But given the feasibility and the resources that we have, the idea of having these standardized tests, which will be the feature of a lot of students in different layers in India for different disciplines, the idea itself is sort of saying that, look, you may not get it right the first time around, or you might not, there might be something that can go wrong in terms of your emotion, motivations the first time around you take a test. But you have 3 different opportunities in a calendar year to do this, right? Which means very unlikely that your emotions will not be in place all the 3 times, or very unlikely that you will have a lot of anxiety to do with the exams all the 3 times. I'm just giving you that as an example to say that inherently the policy has taken into account some such research which says that performance on the test is also a function of emotions the individual takes.
Yes.
Right? That is one such instance that I can talk about. The second instance is particularly again because I come from higher education setup, something that the new education policy sort of recommends and sort of is now being implemented in most of the higher education across India is the flexibility that it offers to the students. So a lot of us are now looking at stackable degree programs where you come in as a student, you see what is that you want to pick up as a know-how. If you want to exit after some point in time, you can exit, go do work, and utilize that know-how, and then come back again and then further pursue. Right? So that kind of flexibility in terms of stackable degree programs, which was perhaps not there a decade ago, is now kind of a commonplace even amongst the IITs. Right? So where a lot of our programs are being by design made stackable for students to come in, pursue to the extent that they want to, and then move on. Right? So that's something of a major impact that it could have, especially on higher education. I do also know of some bit of impact that the new education policy has had to the school education, particularly the change in the definitions of what constitutes a high school versus a primary school versus pre-primary school now is being shifted, and that inherently has gotten a whole lot of benefits for school education as well, in terms of how you look at a kid and the progression of the kid in different settings. So across the board, I would think that whatever steps are being taken as part of the new education policy are concurrent with the emerging research on our understanding of education attainment, student performance, intelligence, and so on and so forth. Of course, I have to evolve. It's a living document, so it is bound to change, and hope it would keep up with the times and our understanding of the world around. But as far as I see, it's a cutting-edge document that we are in some ways, at least the student community now has a lot more flexibility inbuilt into a whole lot of education options, which are perhaps not there at the beginning.
The last point that you made is what I was thinking about before you had said it, which is it can be a cutting edge document, but it has to evolve with time. One of the problems with policy is that once you have made it, that is what it is, and you don't touch it till kingdom come, right? And we live in a very software dominant world where you get regular patches, you get regular software upgrades to your favorite applications. Suddenly the experience goes up, suddenly the interface changes, and it's all in the works. So this ties into two things, which is one, the policy is made, policy is implemented, policy implementation affects students, faculty, everybody in the ecosystem. All activities by agents in the ecosystem deliver data. How do you get this data fed back to the researchers?
Right.
How do you analyze that data for specific outcomes, publish papers, discuss those outcomes, whether they are favorable or unfavorable in terms of where the country needs to go?
Right.
And how do you plug that back into the policy, almost like a software upgrade or a patch
Right.
or a hot fix,
Right.
to actually upgrade the policy standard, so the cycle actually keeps going on and the policy is not just. See, the thing is, it should not be new education policy of 2021, 2022, whatever. Okay. It has to almost be like software. New education policy V 1.7.1, 1.7.3, 1.7.9, 2.1.3. Then you will realize that yes, there is progress being made in real time.
Right.
And it's not like people want change that the government is not reacting. It will be that the government has taken a tech first approach, techno-legal approach, updating the document. Now it's in the hands of the people to go implement it.
And I think that is being done, because see, what we have seen at least in the past decade is a whole lot of push on the ranking mechanism. See, whether it is NARF ranking frameworks of the higher education institutions or best school ranking that the Ministry of Education publishes for some such schools. Largely, what ranking does is it is a feedback mechanism, and usually the ranking processes are for you as an institution to disclose what we have been doing for the past 1 year, and there's a prescribed format through which this data collection happens. Then there is an analysis on this ranking data. All of this data is publicly available for researchers also to pick up. So I think we are moving towards that, and this is a great push to be able to rank, because the moment you start pushing them on ranking, then you're also pushing people to take those policies seriously, people to sort of implement those policies and then give back feedback. Right? So I think we are building that kind of feedback mechanism with the ranking frameworks and the push on ranking across the board, not just for education. I can see that in many other aspects as well, where the government is deliberately looking at getting that feedback from the field and then using that to tell the world outside, because ranking also builds in those incentives, right? So for the stakeholders to take these norms seriously and then work on it. So I think we are on the way to it, and it's always there is a scope for improvement. There is a scope for more, real-time changes in the policy part that perhaps we have not yet seen. And right now we are looking at maybe a decade as a timeline for something to change, rather than, let's say, once a month or let's say once in a year. But I'm sure we are going to get there, right? And we are trying to build those systems in place where this can perhaps happen. One way to do that is to get that feedback, report that data, and then I'm aware of at least in certain policy settings and process settings, at least with respect to education, these are done in real time. And so every month, the institutions are to go back and report what has been done in the past one. So we are getting there. And of course, it's a behavioral change is often tough and difficult to sort of execute. But I think we are on the path. And it's a good move to get the data and then incentivize it in a form of ranking. While it might sound a bit narrow, but I think it helps push people to implement the policies in a better on that.
Understood. I want to come to your emergent ventures research grant. And I found it to be fascinating because on one hand, we're talking about education policy, we're talking about rationality, we're talking about the need to upgrade your traditional MBA to a tech stacked MBA, you know, all of that is fascinating. But your emergent ventures research grant is even more fascinating to me. So, can you talk a little bit about that and where the genesis for researching that came from?
Right. So while I was looking at over the past few years, I started off talking about intelligence, rationality, trying to understand, how do we make sense of human behavior. Eventually, what I could also relate to is all of this is also related to the kinds of choices that we make in terms of careers. Right? So, which is formally the understanding of this is formally known as human capital, which is also something of interest that emerged from my earlier understanding on cognition, human behavior, and etc. The idea is very simple that look, why do we get educated? Why do we get ourselves educated? Why do we get ourselves into different career propositions? Is essentially we want to end up in a job. So we want to make ourselves life meaningful in one way that can be made meaningful is by seeking certain activity that we will be interested in, and if there is monetary opportunity to be made from that activity, then why not? And largely, human capital is that formal domain which tries to understand what are all the kinds of capabilities, skill sets that individuals in a given geography sort of invest in, develop, and how do they sort of transfer these skill sets into more tangible economic outcomes for themselves as well as for the geography at large. Right? So that's been the slight transition that I made over the recent times. While initially I was more looking at the individual outcomes, over time I said, okay, how does it all matter to a country like us? And how does it all matter to an organization which sort of is going to depend on whosoever these people are who are intelligent, rational, and so on and so forth. And that's where this connect between education and what we see out there in terms of firms is the idea of labor market. And labor market largely depends on human capital. And one of the things that, given the ecosystem and given the kind of experiences that we get to have as faculty, we are also sort of accustomed to the realities of how human capital works in a country like ours, how labor markets kind of work in a country like ours. And one of the things that always fascinated me was in the way we sort of understand skill. Right. So, for example, where I am right now, the Jodhpur as a city holds prominence not just for the tourism part, but also for the kind of skill sets that people here bring to the table in terms of arts, handicrafts, music, and so on and so forth. Now, when you look at them and look at the kind of skill that they sort of acquire with no formal education whatsoever in these domains, they largely inherit from their families who are traditionally into the arts and handicrafts. Now, they pick up a skill set, they pick up a certain know how that is kind of exquisite when the final product comes out. Right? And there is a certain economic value that's put on the outcome. But none of this, perhaps in a formal sense, I can say that he or she is skilled, right? Because he or she does not have perhaps a training in design or training in product design or training a degree program in, let's say, National Institute of Design. Right? So none of these arts and handicrafts people come with any kind of formal training, especially the ones who are somebody whom I have been accustomed. They are all very skillful, but at the same time, they don't have any kind of expertise that they can show in a piece of paper, like let's say a design student could do. So then the question was, what is all of this all about? Right? Is it not skilling in the first place? Is it not human capital that we should sort of, think about, encourage, and sort of build on? It's not for only engineers, doctors, and so on and so forth. Right? So that's the root of how I landed up with the emerging ventures research track, where largely what I wanted to study was how human capital in this country and how labor markets in this country sort of work. And for anybody who knows anything about labor markets in India, largely ours is a kind of a dichotomous one where there is a small section of the labor market which gets into formal employment with certified skill sets and so on and so forth. So somebody who does an engineering degree from an institution which is accredited by UGC or national institutes of importance they get to have a degree at the end of 4 years, which certifies that they are skilled on this count, which they have done through a whole lot of courses. And then they are out there in the job market interviewing for jobs of the relevant kind. And then the employer evaluates them, hires somebody, does not hire somebody else, and so on and so forth. And then there is a contract that is given out at the end of that process. Right? And the contract is an employment contract which determines the negotiate, which in some sense documents the relationship between the employer and the employee. Now, this part of the labor market is kind of very minuscule compared to the number of people who are willing to work or who are in the age where they can work and earn for themselves. While it might not be accurate, maybe approximately this is like 1% of the employable population in India perhaps gets its employment from the formal labor market. Maybe a good chunk of it is outside the formal employment, which means they do still find work, they do get skilled, but none of this is documented, right? So they don't have certificates to show, they don't have employment contracts to show, but at the end of the day, they are getting into economic activity. And one of the things that I've observed when I was studying these labor markets is, and again, as a kid growing up in India, everybody can sort of relate to this, is there is one particular geographical space in a city or in a town in India where you see this happening in front of you every day, right? So which is what we often refer to as labor Addas, right? Which is
Yes.
these spot markets for labor that come in early mornings in the busiest part of cities or towns, where people who are looking out for employment come in and stand in the middle of the chowki or the road, and then there are people who have information about where the jobs are for that day in that particular geography who come in, who are often referred to as employment brokers, who come in, or labor brokers, who come in and sort of negotiate with these laborers who are standing out there seeking employment, and then understand and come to an understanding that, look, this is the work site, this is where you need to go, this is how much you would be paid for the kind of work that you do. And then they're off to the work site for that. Right? And this is usually the market sort of thins down after 9 or 10 in the morning. Most of them would have found their work for the day. Some such would not have found, and this is seasonal in terms of variation happens depending on which geography you're in, what kind of weather conditions exist at that point in time, and all of that. But the point is, this is one physical market where I can see how people who are otherwise called non-skilled or unskilled, but perhaps have a whole lot of skill set with them, but they're not documented. So that's why perhaps we may sort of bracket them as non-skilled or unskilled. But at the end of the day, also find employment. But none of that is getting documented anywhere. And that was what I thought perhaps that I could sort of look at and understand. So how do these labor markets function? While I know something of the formal labor market, right? So a lot of my students go into the formal labor market, a lot of them seek employment. Most of, let's say, formal studies that we do on human resources, human capital are largely about formal labor markets, and we do understand some bit of dynamic there, right? When how technology firms are sort of hired and how do they throw out people and what happens in the game, all of that. That's one, just to quote as an example. But the point is, a significant chunk find employment not through, by having CVs and standing out there on the labor. Right? So, like, quite a lot of times I give this as an example to my students. So what if, imagine if all of these labor had a CV with them and they're standing there, and then there's somebody who's coming in as a recruiter who's looking at the CV and then negotiating on the employment, and then essentially that's what is happening. But it's just that they don't have a CV. These guys don't have a brand name to attach for themselves. They don't have an employer. So the project is largely about understanding what are the existing, how do these markets function? Who are all those people who come in and negotiate for employment there? Who are all the labor brokers who come in? What kind of background do they come from? What kind of labor gets discharged to these labor markets? How do they look at performance management? If at all there is any kind of performance management in this case, how does incentivization happen? How does the incentivization largely through compensation? How does it happen? This is largely what I proposed and the grantees or grant awarding institutions sort of agreed to provide for the initial funding to try and understand these labor markets. But the idea is eventually to try and see is there any intervention that is possible in this kind of a setting, right? Because we know, at least as an outsider to these labor markets, but somebody who's observing them closely, and something which is already been documented extensively is quite often when you're non-documented as a laborer, that sort of gives you certain sort of that sort of brings in certain kinds of issues. For example, if something goes wrong at the work site, right now, can you as a laborer go and claim insurance? Can you go and claim anything from as damages from the work site owner, right, or the employer, or is the labor broker involved in any of this? Who guarantees that the compensation will be paid on time? Mostly none, right? So there's no guarantees that are there in any of these things. So which means there is no way to fall back on any state mechanism to get these issues redressed, right? So for example, if I have a formal employment contract, I can always end up going to the state and say that look, the employer promised me so and so, but has not delivered this so and so. So kindly come and sort of negotiate or help me out of this. But that doesn't happen in the labor markets of the kind that I'm talking about. So the eventual idea is to say that look, while we understand there are issues, is there any way that can perhaps solve it? I mean, is there any technology solution that is sitting out here? We are, so it's been about 8 months now since we started that work, and we are coming to a certain kind of understanding, which eventually perhaps maybe some other time might be able to talk to on what could be the possible solutions and whether they are feasible to implement. But broadly, that's been the transition. What I do with emerging ventures grant is largely to understand these informal labor markets, predominantly that operate through informal labor Addas that we see day in day out, and try and understand what happens in these markets.
Venkat, that is absolutely thrilling research. And I know that you are, I think, judging by what you said, you are getting your first streams of data in
Right.
and you're parsing it and you're breaking down and you're judging your own assumptions versus what the data is saying. So, which is why you want to be careful and say that I'll tell you next time what I've actually found.
Yeah.
Now I'm telling you this is an entire laundry list of what I think I might have found. So I am looking forward to our next conversation. So Venkat, just before we close, let's have a quick rapid fire round.
Sure.
And I want to have your unfiltered thoughts to these questions.
Certainly.
Okay. What's the one piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
One piece of advice that I would give my younger self is to be a bit more courageous with my thoughts than what I was.
Okay. What are some books that have changed the way you think and engage with the world?
The books that have changed me, predominantly there's only one that I go back to as a kid that I read was Violin by Henry David Thoreau. And that sort of gave me a particular, now as an adult, it sort of gives me a certain perspective as, what is it that we do as human beings and how are our society structured? How do we sort of engage with them? So it gives me a perspective ever so often. So Violin would be that book.
Okay. What annoys me about other people that I sometimes do myself?
Okay, that would be largely to do with not expressing certain thoughts in certain contexts. So you tend to be closed for whatever reasons. While you want to say something, you not want to because of any other reasons. So that's what annoys me about myself and perhaps about me.
What's your go-to method for overcoming procrastination or writer's block?
The go-to method is basically reading. So what I do is whenever I'm off in terms of quote unquote writing, I go back to reading a lot of things to see what exactly happens, and then that sort of lingering time helps me come back to say, okay, what is it that I want? Because whenever you write, there are two ways to do academic research. Right? One is being very objective about what you're trying to study and then churning out papers basis that, and the other way is you're involved in what you're wanting to say and what you're wanting to do. So I'm more of the second kind, so I do take a lot of time in terms of sort of getting my ideas together and thoughts together. So in the intervening time, you've got about.
If you could time travel 25 years into the future, what are the top three questions you would want answers to regarding the state of technology and society?
Right. One would be whether AI would replace everybody of us. Uh, would it stop hallucinating and would it sort of, become more human-like? That would be one question that I would have about technology. The second is whether would we be able to find extraterrestrial life uh, going around the universe as we speak. And third is there anything else that sort of stops us from being better off to other people than ourselves. So that is, I think, the last question.
If you had to condense your life philosophy into one sentence, what would it be?
Life philosophy in one sentence would be to be good to yourself and others.
What's a recent discovery or a piece of information that has blown your mind?
The recent piece of information that has blown my mind, largely this is not recent, but something that I sort of got across is there is a former branch of science called ethology, which is animal science of animal behavior. And what were the initial set of pieces of work that came about in ethology sort of like one is to do with how animals sort of come to this world with a whole lot of innate behaviors, which I think now is also sort of established that human beings also have a whole lot of innate behaviors. So ethology as a branch is something that comes across as fascinating ever so often.
Amazing. Uh, what's the most valuable piece of advice you've ever received and who gave it to you?
Right. So, valuable piece of advice that I've got is actually not in person, but something of a video that of a professor who actually won Nobel Prize, Venkat Ramakrishnan, when he took an award as Person of the Year in NDTT. He sort of sums it up in one sentence where he says that once you move up in life, the only thing that you perhaps should be doing is to see how you could get other people to move up in life. So that's one piece of advice that has stayed with me for this point in time and perhaps forever.
Uh, Venkat, my last question to you is what's one daily habit or routine that has had a profound impact on your life?
Again, I would go back to reading. So every day, morning or evening, most times of the day, I spend looking out for anything that comes out new in terms of ideas. And that sort of helps. So it almost happens that I feel a bit low only when I'm not able to read something good. So that's largely it.
Venkat, thank you so much for being on the Inductive Economy. It
Thanks a
was
lot.
it was a thrilling experience for me, and I hope we get up round two with you, where we
So
can discuss labor addas even more deeply. And I'm fascinated to find, everything that you've discovered in that time period over your work. And thank you so much once again.
thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nish, for